Hey, Red Clay Rambler fans, I want to thank you for spending your time with me listening to world-class artists talk about their lives and creativity. It's an honor to produce this podcast, and I appreciate you choosing to listen week in and week out. As we wrap up 2021, I need your help funding future episodes. For our fall fund drive, I ask that if you're able, you commit $4 a month to the show. That's only $1 an episode to keep you inspired and connected to the greater ceramic community. There are two easy ways to donate, one through the PayPal portal at talesofaredclayrambler.com/donate, or by making a monthly pledge at patreon.com/redclayrambler. If you join Patreon today, you can access perks like podcast swag, as well as the Patreon-exclusive Tales from the Vault podcast, which features remastered episodes that are no longer available on major podcast apps. Thanks for the support, and let's get on with the show. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 398 of the podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Today on the show, I talk with Gay Smith. She is a potter in the Pinland area that makes beautiful thrown and altered porcelain vessels. In this interview, we talk about what she learned from being a community member in the Findhorn community of Scotland early in her ceramic career, and then how she took those principles and applies them to developing ceramic community in the mountains of North Carolina. If you'd like to see examples of her work, you can visit GertrudeGrahamSmith.com. Before we get to that, I wanted to thank the folks that have been donating to our fall fund drive. If you're able, please make a donation. Our goal is to have 100 donors by the end of December. If you'd like to get involved, you can do that at talesofaredclayrambler.com/donate. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. Well, let's start talking about literature, because you started studying English.
Oh, literature. Oh, yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit about your early interest in that, and then how you think the structure of writing, whether it's poetry or short form stories, how that translates into ceramics, or maybe doesn't translate into ceramics.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, when I entered university, and I went to Harvard, and when I entered Harvard, I thought I was going to be a doctor. And then they wheeled in the little animals that you're meant to cut up. And I thought, I'm sorry, but I just don't think I can do this. And I love being outside. And I think clay also, there's something about clay, working with clay. It's very similar to working in your garden or working with earth. And so the nature of the material itself feels like you're in nature, that you're outside. A piece of paper had landed on my dorm bed at Radcliffe, and it came from the physical education department for extracurricular activities, and pottery was listed as an extracurricular activity through the phys ed department at Harvard because they have no art department. So I saw that piece of paper and I just thought, well, that sounds really interesting. And so I went down and tried it out, and I became obsessed with it, I guess, or passionate about it. It was one of those, it was a nonverbal activity. And I've always been pretty adept verbally, but it was a nonverbal activity that could not necessarily be articulated. You can't sort of tell people. I've learned lately, more recently, how to describe what I'm doing more exactly. But in those days, which was back in the 70s, it was sort of magic. Nobody really had the verbs or the words to describe what was going on. So it was challenging to me. And I actually like a challenge. And I think potters like challenge, or we wouldn't keep doing what we're doing, because we never are finished learning. We're never finished being creatively, technically, and aesthetically challenged. So I became enamored of this, and then wanted to go to art school, but just my parents were like, no, you can't go to art school. You're at Harvard University. So I thought, how am I going to get through this? How am I going to get through another, 3 years, 4 years of this? And I had always enjoyed reading. And so I majored in literature. And what I've sort of figured out between reading and listening and making is I created this kind of idea that the various techniques that I use in my work are like vocabulary words. So what I learned from a particular teacher, it could be any technique. It could be, there's the grammar, there's the basic structure, which is how to make a pot. We all have to learn how to do those basic things, like how to speak, how to write. And then beyond that, when you start entering into the more descriptive or metaphorical aspects, then you're talking about vocabulary words that are passed along to you by a teacher. So they could be things like how to facet, with the wire tool, or how to facet with a knife, or how to do a brush stroke on clay, how to print on clay. It could be any of these techniques. And to me, a lot of those are like vocabulary words. And I think I started thinking about this first when I was exposed to Michael Symon's work, because Michael Symon is someone that I think has had a huge and extensive influence on the contemporary clay community and contemporary clay culture. And aesthetic. And what he did, as far as I can tell, is he went back into history and he looked at these historical pots, from Persia and Iran, and he brought back and put into contemporary clay certain aspects of that, like the little square boxes. He started putting things up on little feet. So let's just take as an example, putting something up on little feet. Well, that to me is a vocabulary word that hadn't necessarily been ubiquitous throughout the clay community before he kind of started doing that. And there are probably other people that I don't know of who were also bringing that in at the same time. But that to me is a vocabulary word. I learned that word. That's a new word for me. And then I start collecting words from other artists or from things that I'm seeing, and I start putting them together as sentences. And then those sentences might become a pot, so to speak. And then from that pot, I start thinking about other ways of looking at it. You change the way those words go together. You turn the pot upside down and it becomes something else. You see that, and then you create something from that. And then those become a paragraph, and then pretty soon it becomes an essay, and then pretty soon it becomes a novel, or it becomes your body of work, because you're just continuing to add those words to your vocabulary. Just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so when I'm teaching, I'll say, sometimes you describe those things as tools. They're in your toolbox. So I start with a brand new form, and I might not know what kind of attachments to put on them. But I have these vocabulary words that I've used before. And so I can kind of play around with them and test them and see if they work with this new piece or not. And if they don't, I have to go out and find a new word or a new sentence or a new way of expressing it. So that's how I have translated that into my work. But also I have found that it's really helpful for people that I work with in a classroom situation to be able to describe to them what is going on with their hands on the pot and how to perceive, and translate what they're doing in terms of pressure, where they're putting their fingers, all that in order to help them make their work better. And I think that is a kind of a gift from being an English major and being interested in words and how to describe things.
Well, we're going to talk about teaching in a little bit, but I wanted to come back to literature and think about editing. Because when you're a writer, you're editing. And even if let's say you're writing about another piece of literature, you're starting with something that is already happening, interpreting your own thoughts about it, writing them down, and then editing them to make them potent, so that you're not using too many words. I mean, I guess it kind of depends on the writer. Some writers use a lot of words and some don't. But I think the process of editing ceramics is that and I don't want to speak for you, but I think that process is about making a pot potent. Like, how do you make the form without anything extra? So can you talk about that process for you?
I think because I'm not using a paintbrush to direct one's eye, for me, the potency of my work comes in making forms that are really strong. And so the editing for me comes in looking, I work in a series. And so that helps me in terms of editing. I'm not making, when I sit down to make a board of mugs, I'm making a series because that's how I started. I started as a functional potter. I would make 100 mugs a day. I only quit at 100 mugs because I couldn't pull 100 handles off those mugs the next day without hurting my shoulder. So I'm used to working in bunches that are the same form. So I'll start a board, and the most I make at a time now is 20 mugs. I'll start, and it'll take me 4 or 5 pieces before I'm actually seeing what I want to see in terms of the form. And for me, the challenge that I've set myself is always is I manipulate the surface of the pot while it's wet on the wheel. And so in order for me to maintain the surfaces that I'm using on my pots, and to make a strong form is really challenging because half the time I can't touch the pot from the outside again once I've put the surface in. I'm only allowing myself to manipulate it from the inside. So to get a strong form without being able to manipulate the piece from the outside at the end is very challenging. So I'm always looking for that line between the foot and the rim. What is that profile? What is that line that I'm drawing between the foot and the rim of the pot? Is it, where's the waist? Where's the belly? Where are those proportions? The dynamic between the width of the foot, the width of the belly, the waist, all of those things. That's where the dynamism happens. And it's not necessarily wrong to make, a piece that's just straight up and down and very stable, same with the top, same with the bottom. It's just knowing that what that feeling is the feeling of extreme stability. So the editing for me happens in all along the way as I'm making those pots. Like the first 4 or 5 mugs that I make on a board, maybe one of those will be what I'm headed for. So half the time I'm trashing, like the first 4, maybe 5 pieces. And then I have my example that I want to follow as I'm going along. I see what I'm looking for. It looks dynamic, and that's where I'm headed.
And I can see that in the work. Like when we came over with the class a couple weeks ago, I was looking at the finished work and then also the unfired work. And the lines look different pre-fired than they do after they're fired, you know?
I know.
And it's very interesting to see that. And we should describe that you often will facet or stamp or do something on the surface of a pot. It's porcelain and then it's raw glazed and soda fired. So the kiln is accentuating the marks that you're making. So how did you find a firing process that didn't put an extra layer on? Because it feels like even the fired pots feel really fresh. Like even if they're glassy and hard, they still, that primacy of touch that you have is still there.
I just lucked out. I went to Penland School. And that was the first time I came across soda firing and salt firing. Well, actually not soda firing, it was wood. I didn't find soda. My first experience with soda was in 1993 at the Archie Bray Foundation, but it was salt and wood that I found. And there was something about the way that there was something about the interaction between the flame and the atmosphere and the clay that felt really fresh to me. It was very spontaneous and it felt really fresh. It felt direct. And so with my work, I had been making these pots that had these little blue flowers painted all over them. I mean, I sold hundreds of them. Because it took me a long time to figure out why people respond to those, but it's basically because of the China, the blue and white that was coming out of China and going into Europe. So everybody, Wedgwood, everybody looks at blue and white and they automatically, nobody thinks about it. It's like a completely unconscious response to something that is a functional pot. That's just an assumption. And it's because, and it's an assumption based on something that was a luxury item, that came out of China. And so blue and white, there's something about blue anyway. I have that part, I haven't figured out the larger aspect of blue, but that blue and white in terms of functional pottery. And so I sold tons of those, but I had gotten to the point where it wasn't feeding me anymore. And then I was lucky I went to Penland. And I think then when I went to Archie Bray, I was firing in a wood kiln with, I was so privileged. I was firing in a wood kiln with Josh DeWeese and Mackenzie Smith. And, but the way they were firing the wood kiln was it was full of ash. And it was wiping out the supersaturated copper glazes that I was using them. It was turning them kind of a livery, horrible color, taking out the oxidation of the copper. And so Josh said to me, well, we have this soda kiln. You should try that. We're just finishing building it. And so I put some pieces in there and the color response was just phenomenal. And it was so great with the way that I was working because all the edges, all those impressions, all the edges from the faceting, the edges from the fluting, the edges, wasn't doing the impressing then at that point, but all that tactile quality, the soda wasn't hard, it was soft. And it was a fluid. It created, even though they were glossy, some of them, there's a fluidity with the sodium that you get. With salt and with wood, they kind of wipe out certain aspects of the pots. Like the salt bleaches color. The wood ash covers up certain things. I mean, it's not that it's not beautiful, but it covers up stuff. But the soda ash, it's like pouring a fluid that makes everything beautiful into your kiln. and yet it also allows those edges to come away, to peel out and become emphasized.
Your process is very high risk, high reward. Just once firing porcelain and raw glazing it, that could be a disaster in and of itself. So
nobody ever told me I couldn't do it. That's what happened. I was like, I don't know. I guess I don't know where I first started. I guess I started it at the Bray, and I'd been using stoneware. And then when I went to the Bray, I sort of switched exclusively to the porcelain. It was Chris Staley that turned me on to working with porcelain first. Cynthia Bringle said to me, you have to study the work that you're making. You have to study with Chris. And so I went and was Chris's assistant in I think it was, I can't remember, 1987 or something at Penland. And so that's when I got turned on to porcelain. But then, life took me in a different direction. So I was back to stoneware for a while. But when I went to the Bray, I switched totally to porcelain. And in the meantime, I had lived in Scotland and hadn't had a bisque kiln. I'd only had a little fast fire wood kiln to fire in. And I was bisquing my pots in this wood kiln. I'd pull all the bisque pots out, wash all the ashes off, and put them back in the kiln. And I was like, this is really stupid. This is really dumb. I need to just figure this out. And at that point, there was a book that had come out, which was Dennis Park's Raw Glazing and Oil Firing. So he had recipes for glazes, and he had sort of instructions about how to raw glaze. And so I had heard that Douglas Rankin and Will Ruggles did raw glazing. So I knew it was possible. And I knew that Chino was a glaze that worked. It has a high clay content. So I knew that it worked. So I just started raw glazing. And then when I left Scotland and ended up at the Bray with porcelain, I just started raw glazing. Nobody ever told me I couldn't do it.
Well, it works beautifully on the work, but can you describe how do you match pre-fired shrinkage of a glaze to your clay so that it doesn't crack off before it ever gets to the kiln?
Yeah, that's basically, it's not that complicated. It's as if you're, I don't, some people who raw glaze are spraying. That's how they deal with it. They'll spray on bone dry, because the bone dry, most of the shrinkage in pots happens between, as you know, between wet and dry leather, and then once it's bone dry, between bone dry and bisque, it doesn't really shrink very much at all. And then the next shrinkage happens in the high fire, or in the firing. So, and this is all, of course, high fire clay. So what I do is I apply the glazes when the pots are leather hard, and therefore, and then all I have to do, it's like applying a slip. So a slip is clay, so the clay shrinks with the leather hard pot, right? That's why it works. So with all of your glaze formulas, the first thing you do is you just switch out all the kaolin in your glaze formulas for ball clay. What this sacrifices is any ability to be very precise about, your iron content, for instance, because ball clay has an iron content where clay doesn't. So if you're a very, very precision oriented glaze person, glaze techie, then that is, and you're worried about your color and all that kind of stuff, then you'd have to figure that out. But for me, I'm just like, I just put the ball clay in instead of the kaolin. And then I'll always usually I'll add a little bit of bentonite. And the amount of bentonite I add, because of course bentonite is the clay that shrinks the most, the amount of bentonite I add to the glaze is dependent upon how much clay content the glaze has. So the higher the original clay content of the glaze, the less bentonite I have to add. And then it's just a question of kind of working with it to see how it comes out. Because I have actually had glazes that shrink too much and will peel off the pot. Some of the first experiments were, I glaze the pot. I can remember this little, those little faceted mugs I make. I'd put one on, I'd glaze them, a whole shelf of them. I'd put them all on the shelf, and then I'd gone home for the night, and I came back and they'd all shrunk. And there was a nice little ring of powdered glaze around each one of them. They had shrunken away from the glaze. So
When you're working with a clay, what's a porcelain that works well for raw glazing and what's one that doesn't? Like what's the characteristic of the clay itself?
I think the particle size is really important. Like I think having I use a clay that has tile 6 and graulig in it, and the graulig is specifically formulated to have a variety of particle sizes in terms of the kaolin in its formula. And then the tile 6 has the large particle size. So I think a larger particle size in the kaolin helps. But the clay body that I love to use and that works excellently, I got the recipe from Linda Sakura and Matt Metz, and they got this recipe they got from Chris Staley, and it has malachite in it, MOLO kite, which is basically porcelain grog. So it's a grog that has a mesh size that is virtually the same as a glaze ingredient. So you hardly feel it. And that really helps with the shrinkage. It helps because when I'm raw glazing, what I'm doing, because porcelain, it reabsorbs moisture really quickly and easily. So when I'm raw glazing, I have to have the clay has to, it shrinks to leather hard, and then I dip it or pour it, glaze into it or over it. And it has to expand again and then contract again. So like even a mug, I'll put the liner in, it expands, it shrinks. Then I do the outside, it expands and shrinks again. So it has to take a lot of that movement. And so the malachite really helps with that because it helps, it creates, more air within the clay body so it can dry easier, all that, release moisture more easily. Yeah.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Amico Brent. For the past 100 years, Amico Brent has been creating ceramic supplies for our community, ranging from underglazes to electric kilns, and they have no plans of slowing down. With over 3,000 products, Amico Brent's top priority is making sure that all of their customer needs are met. From the professional to the student and everyone in between, their high-quality materials enable you to make your best work. To learn more, check them out at amico.com or on Instagram and Facebook at Amico Brent. You can also show them how you use Amico by sharing your work online with the hashtag HowIAmico. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfeldcollection.com. Well, you've talked about that you lived in different places and that's affected your working. And one of them was a community in Scotland, Findhorn. Mm-hmm. Is that the name of it?
Yep, Findhorn. Yeah.
Can you talk about learning to live in community and being a community potter versus a studio potter making artistic decisions?
Yeah, it was, I sort of joke about it and I say it was both a blessing and a curse to live there, as in many ways. As a human being, it was a blessing to live amongst people who share a particular worldview or value system, and the value system there had to do with cooperating with other human beings and cooperating with nature. And that, and so everything was geared towards that. And living there, you worked in groups of people, and so the necessity was to be able to get along with people, resolve your conflicts in a loving way, and so you could continue to do your work. Having lived in that way as a loving family, which consisted of 100 people, it's really hard to leave and come out into the cold world and not have this kind of community, this really sense of close community of people who know you intimately and support you. So that's why it's a blessing and a curse in that way. As an artist, it was a really interesting experience living there. I loved it, but it was also challenging, which could be the curse, because my work there, it was for the community. The pottery that I made was for the community, and so it fulfilled it was for the secular and spiritual life of the community. So there were objects that I made, that were specifically to sit in the middle of a meditation hall. And I made everything from cups and salt and pepper shakers and candle holders and, wall sconces and pitchers and bowls. I made bowls, for instance, that were used twice a day to hold food, salads, potatoes, anything. So those got washed, pulled out from underneath where they were stored and stacked under a sink. Had food in them, food taken out of them, washed, dried, stacked again, twice a day, boom, 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 just like that. I made, spice and herb holders for the kitchen. I couldn't stamp the names of the herbs on the sides because they would break. That was useless. So I made 75 or 100 of them. But then I made 150 or 200 lids because every lid had to fit in every single one. Because otherwise, of course, the lid, somebody's going to break a lid and you can't have it. It just, that's the way it worked. So it was an incredible thing making objects that were used by the people that I lived with and loved. I imagine that it was like being a village potter in a pre-industrial culture where I was making all the things that people needed to use in their lives as much as possible. And having that connection, which wasn't necessarily, it wasn't commodified. It didn't have to do with the money. It just had to do with fulfilling the needs of the community in which I lived. That was an experience which I think has put me in a place in terms of how I am in my work that's probably, I don't know, I think it's probably different than a lot of other people experience themselves. There was a certain frustration there in it because that there's a self-expressive part of being a ceramic artist that was somewhat thwarted or frustrated there because just doing something that had nothing to do with anything except for my own kind of following my own aesthetic wasn't necessarily the way to contribute to that community. So there, it was a double-edged thing.
Can we talk about the spiritual part of that? Are you comfortable talking about that?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Because one thing I've realized about communal living, I lived in California for a while, and in the Santa Cruz Mountains outside of where we live, like people still lived in communes. It was still happening. The move towards communal living in the 60s was still just pushing right on forward. But these are just observations that I have about that style of living. If there is some spiritual component, it feels to me like it holds everything together in a different way than, say, when just means of production is the main thing, like we're going to live and work together, sometimes it seems like there's more strife there. But when there's a spiritual thing that holds everything together, it's almost like because you agree to follow the spiritual path, it changes the way people have conflicts. But I've never lived in a commune. So this is the question is that true? Like, is it true that having a spiritual foundation that everyone is adhering to makes things smoother? Or do you think communal living is just hard and it's always hard no matter what?
Yeah, I think having a sense of a higher purpose. Um, at Fintorn, we really believe that we are transforming ourselves and human nature. Like that we're that the conflict arises out of lack of awareness or lack of compassion, and and uh, so our job there was to increase our awareness and increase our ability to be compassionate with each other, and and behind that is kind of an underlying assumption or belief that by doing that we are changing ourselves, and therefore the higher purpose is to change to change humanity so that humanity itself becomes more compassionate, able to live on the planet without warfare, able to support each other in in supplying basic human needs to each other. So that's sort of the underlying principle of it, and behind that also is the belief that everything is alive. So for me, the clay is alive. It has its own life force, and so it's my job as a potter to honor that, and to allow, for me, working with clay is a dialogue. I mean, I know it looks like my work, but I feel like what I'm trying to do is to bring expression to a certain quality of clay, or the clay is experiencing or expressing itself through me, and that my response to the material is what's enabling that to happen. And so the thing about living at Fintorn is wasn't just about humanity. It's like this idea that we're all interconnected, that the planet is one being, every part of it, everything from the rocks in the ground to the stars overhead, to humanity, to the animals, to insects, to plants, everything. We're all one. And that the need is to learn to honor that and get along with that, get along with each other, to support each other, nourish each other.
Can you talk about sort of the communal style of living in terms of the pace of work? Like, did you wake up in the morning and work like a studio potter, or did you wake up in the morning and meditate and then work like a studio potter? Like, what was the actual life like?
Well, you got up in the morning and you went to what's called sanctuary, which is meditation. But the thing about living at Fintorn, you could ask the great thing about Fintorn is you could ask every single person who's ever lived there what their experience and what they think about the place, and you'd probably get as many different answers from all these people as you would. And I think that's one reason that it's survived for so long, is that there isn't a guru. There's not one person in charge. It's that there's a constantly evolving, experiment in how to live in a community oriented way with people. So, but my day would be, I would get up in the morning, I'd go to sanctuary, which is a group meditation. And then after meditation, I go to the studio. And then in the studio, because it's in Scotland, we had tea breaks. So you go to work and then you have a tea break, which could last, that it's usually was a half an hour. And then you'd go back to work, and then you go have lunch. Well, lunch was like an hour and a half. And there was also the opportunity to meditate at lunchtime. And then you work until tea break in the afternoon. And then you work for another hour or so. And then you have dinner. So it was nothing like what I work here, which is hours and hours beyond that. And then also living in that kind of way, you have to meet with people all the time because there's stuff that comes up. So you have to make decisions, because everything is made, the decisions are made by groups of people. And so that takes a lot of interaction. And so once a week in the studio, the potters there, we would have what we called an attunement, which was to talk about not only just the practical aspects of what was happening in the studio, but also to talk about how we were feeling as a group how each person was feeling in there. And if there were any issues in terms of conflicts or anything that needed to be talked about, then that was the place that we would resolve them, was in that meeting once a week.
Yeah, as you're describing this, what it reminds me of is Pinland. And after teaching a 6-week concentration where I was with the students, like we were living in community together in a way that I've never done with students before. So how do you think your experience living in community in Findhorn taught you how to live in community in other places? Because you've been in Bakersville, you've been in the general Pinland area for quite a while now. Did that influence that?
Oh, I think it's had a huge influence. Penland is probably the closest thing to Findhorn that I have experienced out here without having sought out other intentional spiritual communities. At Penland, it has what it did for me at Penland, apart from just teaching the practical aspects of making pots, it made me aware of, like, for instance, in a concentration class, which is 6 to 8 weeks, how important it is for people to feel comfortable in that room, and how important it is to create a feeling of a group identity or a cohesiveness or a supportive atmosphere for everybody to thrive in. And how important it is to take care of any potential conflicts between people that might occur, because if they're not taken care of over an 8-week period, those things can fester and create a terrible experience for certain individuals in that room, which of course you don't want in that clay studio. And there's at Penland, in the clay studio or any of the other studios, there's a sense of common purpose. I think probably in clay, it's more so a sense of common purpose because you're sharing firings. So everybody's working towards a shared thing. They're not working on individual projects. There's always that sense of community with potters because of those shared firings at Penland. So, so yeah, there. And then also just living in Bakersville, I've always been interested in trying to create situations that benefit more than one person. So, for instance, the Spruce Pine Potters Market, I was one of the founding people of the Spruce Pine Potters Market, which is a group of 30 or so clay of the best potters in Mitchell and Yancey County. We get together once a year and produce a show. We organize it ourselves. A lot of times, and when I first moved here, people would come and do studio tours and move around. And we thought, well, it'd be great if we could just bring everybody together on one weekend a year and just have a whole bunch of people come on that one weekend to one place. And then the other thing that I did with Susie Lindsay and Kent McLaughlin about 10 years ago was start the Mica Gallery, which is another cooperative gallery. So those are, I'm always curious about how to create things that are cooperative ventures that will benefit more than just one person. And so those are the two main ways that I've sort of translated it here, living here.
Yeah, let's talk about the gallery. It's an amazing, the people that are there. I mean, I was taking students there, and we could start on that side of the street and then go to the other side of the street and see other galleries. And it was just like, it really gives an artistic anchor to downtown Bakersville. So can you talk about that cooperative structure, how that actually works?
When we got together, we wanted to, I think there were two things that we really wanted that we knew would make it work for everybody. One of the main principles we started was everybody needs to have an equal stake in it, and everybody needs to have an equal voice. So there's no one person that owns any more of it than anybody else, and everybody's voice is heard. Getting everybody's voice heard is more challenging because that depends on who's facilitating our meetings and who's talking to whom. And so that just takes a certain amount of vigilance and awareness. So those were two things that we started with. And then in order to avoid conflict, we created a really kind of bizarre system of how to measure space in the gallery. So we wanted to have, we have 2D artists and we have 3D artists. And we just created this, I don't know what you would call it, some sort of mathematical equation, so that equates wall space with floor space with square footage. And I mean, we can change that formula anytime we want, but we understood that it was really, really important that there be a structure around that, so that people actually, so we had a piece of paper that we could pull out and we could say, well, so-and-so has this many feet on the wall, which equates to so-and-so having this many feet on the floor, square footage on the floor, so that so everybody has a voice in terms of whether it looks equal or not. We wanted everybody's work to be featured equally. And then we also have spaces which are common spaces where the work is displayed. And the people who put that work out for us are really aware of making that equal too. And then the other thing that we wanted was for each artist to have control over their own display space, but we also didn't want it to look like a flea market. So we had to agree on, what our display units, so to speak, were going to look like. So all of that took a lot of discussion in the beginning. And then of course, there's just the nuts and bolts. What kind of business structure are you going to come up with that's going to work? We decided on a limited liability corporation. So we're all equal partners. We could have gone for an S corporation, which is what I belonged to years ago in Maine. I belonged to a co-op there, a gallery there that was an S corporation. And so people owned shares. But what happened there was that certain members then bought shares of other members. So there's certain members that own more shares than other members. And so we didn't want that for this. We wanted this to be equal all along the way. And then we all work the same amount of time in the gallery. I think the thing that's great about the gallery, apart from it being a business, is that it is a community. It feels like a family. So if something happens to someone, like tragically this year, we lost Kent McLaughlin, who was, Susie's husband and a dear friend, and someone who was really valuable to us. But what we did was we all of us took over all the jobs that Susie and Kent would have had in April. And so we've been doing that for the year. So what that means is, that they could still have a presence in the gallery. They can still have their membership in the gallery, but have a support system which enables them to do that. And so those are the kinds of things, we've had in the past. We had someone in the gallery who had cancer and needed to have chemotherapy. And really, so what we did was we just took over all of her shifts all of her duties and all of her shifts so that she could stay in the gallery. So those are kind of the tragic aspects of how we are together as a family. But, we also have fun, like we're going to have a Christmas party in December. So, yeah.
Well, these systems of mutual support are just so natural. I mean, the thing that I think about as you're describing both communal living, communal gallery, is how strange capitalism is, where one person owns the means of production and everyone else is a worker. Like that, it's a system that we're trying out on a global scale, and I wonder if it will succeed because it has so many negative effects on the individual life. As to where like communal living and communal working, it's something that's been tried and true over millennia. And even though there's tons of conflict in those situations, they tend to resolve themselves in a way in which you feel like a family. Like I've worked for companies in which I really did feel like I was living in a family and working in a family. And I've worked for some where I felt like I was a number, and I was just like a worker on a line. I think it's interesting to hear stories about how this actually plays out. I hope that will inspire more people to go back to the cooperative way of working.
Mm-hmm. I hope so too. I mean, I do know from having lived at Findhorn that it takes it takes more effort in a way, like my friends who still are living there, who've been living there for 30 something years, 40 something years now. I have enormous respect for them because they are continually changing their sociological, political, economic structures in order to make sure that that the place continues to thrive as a community. And that takes a lot of time and effort. It takes a lot of talking. So for me, I'm very grateful to them because I sort of feel like, oh, they're doing it on behalf of all of us. Every time I go there, I learn something new about something that they're working with there, which is always really exciting. So yeah, I can't, the truth is I can't really see how it's going to work out any other way. To me, it's just, we have to learn to work together on all levels, otherwise, we're kind of done for, really. It's a terrible thing to say.
No, I think that's the reality we're living in. I wanted to wrap up, though, thinking about something that you had written in an article that was about perfecting yourself through work or changing yourself through work. And I really enjoy this. And this is something you had written. This was in a Ceramics Monthly article, and I can't remember which specific one it was, but I'm going to read yourself to yourself. So I hope this is not,
okay, good.
This is not too embarrassing. The more conscious I become, the better my work and my teaching will get. M.C. Richards says in her book, Centering, it's not the pot we are transforming, but ourselves. Her quote may not apply to everyone, but I believe it holds true for me. So can you talk about how the process of working is an act of centering and an act of progression? Like that you're progressing the self in the same way that you're progressing like pots or art.
Yeah, it's a deep question. There's of course there's the part like of making a board of mugs and seeing which one looks like the one that you want to head towards. And so you're moving towards that idea of perfection on the shelf. And so that does get translated internally, that I'm trying always to become better. The idea of trying to become better at what I do is also becoming better at who I am, because for better or worse, I identify as a potter and I identify with my work. On the other hand, there is this kind of mysterious attraction or engagement with the process where I start to follow something like the stamping or the impressing, which just felt right because I love the way the clay responds to when you press something into it, it pushes back. It's not just me pushing into the clay. The clay has a pressure back. And then if you belly it out, it changes it again, which is the clay. The clay is doing that. My fingers are pushing it out, but there's some interaction that's going on. And so I just try something. One just tries something different or sees something different that happens. And then you start if that is attractive, if there's something in that draws you on, you just keep following that. Well, with the stamping, it's a good example. I didn't really know where that was going when I started that. I didn't have an idea or a vision in my mind of where I was going. It just pulled me along. And there was part of me in that process that wasn't sure whether I liked it or not. Did I like this work that I was making? Was it me or wasn't it me? And I remember having a conversation with someone who I really respect, Tom Spleth, who he's now doing paintings, but he was a ceramic artist. I give him grief and he just says ceramics is hard. Anyway, I was talking with Tom about this and he said, you don't necessarily have to like your own work. You don't necessarily have to like it. You just have to be true to it, whatever that is, whatever the nature is of what you're doing that you're following. Don't judge it. Just be true to it. Just follow what feels right. And that has stood me in good stead. And so that, I think, is part of what I hear when I hear what MC Richards has to say, that it's not, it's not the pots I'm transforming, it's myself, because there's something in me that is allowing that change to occur, that's allowing something new and mysterious to enter into me. There's a trust in that, in the process of following one's own vision or artistic vision without judging it very much. And I think that that's also given me a huge respect for everyone's creative process, no matter where you are on the scale. I mean, I think when I first started out, I used to be very judgmental about, well, this pot that this person has made, it could be so much better if blah, blah, blah. And I'm telling myself this, but it's really not about that. It's about, what is that person engaged with? What am I engaged with? What is that person engaged with? What are they trying to say? Where are they trying to go? And supporting that seed, that impulse in that person, in myself. That's really what's important. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. And it makes me think about compassion, like living with more compassion. You talked about that early in the interview, that's one of the things you learned at Findhorn. But putting compassion into practice as a teacher is a whole different thing, because sometimes students do need sharp criticism, and sometimes they actually just need personal affirmation. Like, it's what they need has nothing to do with the pots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Could you talk about, in terms of your teaching, how do you put this loving kindness and compassion as a teacher, but still be able to hold the line of expectation that they, need to be doing something?
I think there's a basic lack of judgment in terms of technique. I mean, I'm pretty strict about, if you really want to make a good cylinder, this is how it happens. It's just mechanics, really. There's certain ways that you have to hold your hands, and there's a certain way that you have to handle the clay in order to create this thing. It doesn't have to do with inspiration. It has to do with hand-eye coordination and how you're going to put that hand-eye coordination into effect to create this thing. It's just really, it's like learning to walk or learning to talk. It's that basic. If you're gonna be a potter, if you're gonna make stuff, this is where you have to start. It's just, there are ways around it, but hand building is one. If you don't want to learn to throw, then hand build. So that I am very strict about those things, because to me that is what enables someone to be creative. There was one time, this was really funny. I had a concentration class, and I had started the concentration class, and I start by asking everybody where they're at and what they came, what their expectations are. But then, of course, immediately I tell them I'm not going to meet their expectations as a teacher. But she was sitting on the wheel, like, I guess we were into our third day, and I was sort of showing them how to pull handles, and I went through the whole, here's what you do, like the whole thing. And I discovered that day that she had never thrown before, but she was doing really well at throwing. I mean, I'd done the basic demos, but it made me understand that just me having the expectation that someone could do something, like approaching them as if they already knew how to do it, but with support rather than criticism, really like made it happen. It was crazy. So I learned a lot just from that. She was very good-hearted about it. I mean, I said to her, "Oh my God, are you okay? I didn't know that." But she was fine. And then like when it comes to looking at stuff, like looking at pots in terms of critiquing, um, I've, and like in a general critique, my first rule for a critique is I don't say there's no wrong and there's no right. There's only a personal opinion. So it's like, this is what I see. I have trouble with the dimensions of the feet under this jar. You know, for me, it would look better, or I would feel more comfortable with it if it was this way. So the rule that I set for anybody in the classroom when we're talking about each other's work is I can't state that there's a problem for me with someone else's piece unless I state it as a personal problem and unless I have the solution. You know, I can't say, oh, this doesn't work. And it's whether it works for me, not works for me. It's not, this is good and this is bad, or I like this or I don't like this. It's either works or it doesn't. It works for me or it doesn't work for me. And it would work better for me if, you know, I have to have the solution. The person who's talking about it has to have the solution, a suggestion, a positive suggestion. That's how I deal with it. And then there's some, you know, it's like, it's just personal. Some people you just know, you just have this sense of how sensitive they are, or how, so it's like you just have to approach each person with where they're at and be sensitive. That's what I think, you know, it's just the way it is.
Well, to wrap up, can you plug your website and then also the Mica website so people could find out more about that as well?
Oh yeah. Okay. So my website is my art name is my grandmother's name, which is Gertrude Graham Smith. I figured that was pretty upper crust sounding. But then really the truth is, you know, a lot of my work, I think I joke about it and I say that it's a combination between looking at my grandmother's fine china on holiday weekend celebrations and all the Walt Disney that I watched as a child, you know, where the teacup and the saucer and the spoon would get up and dance. So that I think my pots are all partying at night. So my website's just www.gertrudegrahamsmith.com. And then Mica is micagallerinc.com. And then I have something else I want to plug, which is this, which is me and a colleague are putting on a Soda Fire conference at the end of April, beginning of May in Nashville, Tennessee. And we think it's the first conference or educational event dedicated to soda firing that we've seen. I mean, there's a lot of events dedicated to wood firing, but we're pretty excited. We have like 6 presenters coming, including myself, and we're going to have, they're going to feed us lunch, and we're going to have keynote speakers, including the person that I think actually got soda firing started in the United States, which is Jeff Zamak, who wrote his, he's like the clay guy. He solves problems. He's in Ceramics Monthly. You can get in touch with him. He's sort of a genius. Anyway, he wrote his master's thesis at Alfred in 1974 on firing with sodium as an alternative to salt. And then our other keynote speaker is Warren Mather, and he's the one who really developed spraying, mixing soda ash with water and spraying it into a kiln. And he wrote an article about that for Studio Potter magazine in 1978. So
wow,
we're pretty excited.
And that's the Clay Lady Campus also, which is they're a great organization. They're really nice folks.
Yeah, she's great. Danielle, they have a clay business. They've got they've got artists in residencies. They've got huge classrooms. They've got classes. They've got galleries. They bring in emerging artists. They've got it's like a Quonset hut. They put all these wheels in there. And so it's really inexpensive for people to come and make pots. They've got a wood kiln. They've got a soda kiln. They've got a reduction kiln. Yeah. She's a powerhouse, and it's an amazing organization. So they're hosting us.
I look forward to people being able to see that. It's called Soda Posium, right?
Soda Posium. So like symposium, but sodaposium. And the website is sodaposium.com.
Well, thanks so much. It was a pleasure to talk today.
Well, thank you, Ben. It's good to see you. And I hope you're going to be posting some pictures of the wee one.
Definitely, I will.
Okay, good.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
I'd like to thank Gay for taking the time to do this interview. It was a pleasure to hear about her process as well as her time in the Findhorn community. Before I go, I wanted to thank today's sponsors, the first of which is Amico Brent. For over 100 years, they've been making ceramic supplies for our community, ranging from underglazes to electric kilns. You can find out more at amico.com. I'd also like to thank the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art for sponsoring this episode. They are an online resource for research and inspiration, and it is the end of the semester here in the United States, so if you're a student, I bet you that you have a paper that you have to write on an artist, and this is the place you should go. There are over 800 artists represented by thousands of objects and the images of those objects, and it's all for free. You can check that out at rosenfieldcollection.com. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you guys for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities whose lands we reside on in the United States, and recognize that we are uninvited guests on the occupied, unceded, and ancestral lands of over 500 nations indigenous to North America. By acknowledging and reflecting upon the contemporary lived experiences and histories of the Indigenous peoples here and globally, we may begin to take essential steps towards creating a more equitable world. Learn more through the hashtag Honor Native Land initiative of the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, and consider contributing to Indigenous-led organizations doing important work to further health and wellness, sovereignty, and self-determination of the first people of the lands you reside. This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.